We're going to start our last panel, which is about the critical issue of terrorist use of the internet. And I think there is a pretty clear consensus over the fact that terrorist groups, and particularly Daesh, have been very successful at using the internet and social media to achieve their goals, whether it is to deliver propaganda to huge masses, or control the media agenda, recruit new fighters, organize and coordinate action. And the Islamic State organization uses, with a pretty impressive savoir-faire, the dark corners of cyberspace, whether it is the technological resources or the legal loopholes, in order to escape law enforcement and armed forces. So this has raised tremendous challenges for security forces, and the response is complicated by many factors. First, shared networks offer multiple and very complex interactions between different domains: security, economy, privacy. A second point is that the private sector plays a critical role, since private platforms are the main vehicle used by terrorists for their recruitment efforts online. And they also have skills, data, and resources that makes them essential partners for governments in fighting terrorism online. And some of them have even launched their own initiatives in coordination with civil society in order to fight these recruitment efforts by terrorist organizations. And finally, there are competing interests both between governments but also within governments. And I think this is particularly well illustrated with the debate over cryptography. If we just take the example of France, because I'm French, so I'm going to take that example. Last month, we had the French Minister of the Interior who announced with his German counterpart that he would want to launch a European initiative to regulate encryption. And that announcement arrived a couple of weeks ago after the National Agency for the Protection of Information System released, or maybe leaked, a note to the press saying that encryption really shouldn't be regulated and that we should do everything to maintain very strong encryption, and any attempt to legislate would undermine strong encryption. So with those challenges, I'm gonna pass it to our distinguished speakers today. They're going to be tackling some of these challenges and addressing some of the key questions on how to counter terrorist use of the internet in such a complex environment. So we have with us Gregory Bauer, who's Deputy General Counsel of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Professor Martin Hellman, who is a Professor Emeritus of Electrical Engineering at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. We have Joëlle, who is Senior Advisor to the Secretary General, European External Action Services in Brussels. Joseph McGee, who is Brigadier General and Deputy Commandant General Operations at the US Cyber Command. And finally, Peter Neumann, who is the director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College in London. So maybe we'll start with Gregory Bauer, maybe if you want to reflect on the encryption debate, both in France and in Europe and in the US, and maybe not just focus on the discussion over encryption, but maybe tell us about considering the difficulty to resolve that debate, what are the alternative solutions?
Sure. Happy to start that off anyways. Thank you very much, Frédérick. Thank you for the invitation. It really is an honor to be here. It's a nice break, frankly, from thinking about and talking about Secretary Clinton's emails for a couple of days anyways, until I get back to Washington on Wednesday night. I do feel a bit like I'm in enemy territory here, though, not because I'm an FBI lawyer here in Silicon Valley, but because I'm a graduate of that aforementioned other school from across the bay. So it's always a little unsettling to be here on the farm, as we call it. As beautiful as it is, Mr. President, and as good as your football team is, there's a lot of, despite our win over Texas the other night, there's a lot of jealousy in Berkeley over how how good the Stanford football program is these days. So we'll leave that alone for now. But it is a real privilege for me to be here and to represent Director Comey and the FBI. We have been talking a lot lately, the director has in particular, about this conversation that needs to happen, needs to be happening about the going dark, as we call it, phenomenon, and what solutions to the debate, to the problem might be out there. And so it's great to be part of this conversation, and the FBI certainly looks forward to continuing to be part of this conversation with this group and others going forward. A couple of initial thoughts, just sort of to tee up the issue from my perspective anyways. First, we can obviously all agree upon, and we've heard a lot of talk in the last day or so about the proliferation, the increase of criminal use of the internet. I mean, this is something that we've been watching. I think we will continue to watch increase in the months and years ahead, and we can all agree it's a significant problem. Rest assured, the FBI is on the front lines of dealing with this problem. Of this fight, we have increased significantly our resources in the cyber area. I think that will only continue in the months and years ahead. And that is in large part due to the fact that there is demand, I think, on the part of the American people and American industry to do just that, to devote more of our resources in this area. And I'll talk a little bit more about that reality in a moment. But after all, we do focus our priorities based upon what the American people want us to do. And so that's why we're increasing our focus in the cyber area. That concern, though, the concern by the American people and the concern on the part of industry, of course, has led to an advancement, as we all know, in technologies to deal with that concern and to solve that problem, specifically encryption. Now, you've all heard the FBI director say before, and I'll repeat it again, we think encryption is a very, very good thing. There's been some confusion about that out there, I think. So we think it's a good thing, but it also creates a problem. It is a good thing, not without costs. And the costs obviously include the ability of criminals generally and terrorists specifically to use end-to-end encryption technology to thwart our efforts at disrupting terrorist plots and bringing to justice those who would carry out such plots. And so it's a good thing, but it's a thing that's not without costs, and we're working very hard to grapple with those costs in a way that we can all agree should be the solution. So the answer, what is the answer? We at the FBI certainly don't know what the answer is. The answer will come, in our view, only after a debate, a discussion, and the American people, through likely congressional action, that is not an oxymoron, although it sounds like one, that considers and balances a variety of different concerns. Public safety, privacy, free expression, cybersecurity, global competitiveness, all of those things need to come into play, need to be part of the discussion about the solution. We are, as the director likes to say, again, we work for the American people. It's not up to the FBI to decide how this debate should be resolved. We will simply implement whatever is decided, but all of those factors, we believe, need to come into play. All of those factors need to be considered. We are confident that the problem can be solved, and we, again, are happy to be part of that discussion and look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Professor Hellman, if you would like to
Thank you.
on that.
Well, that was a great introduction. The idea that we need to debate, I would change just a little bit. We need to have a conversation because we do tend to think too much in terms of debate. So the essence of my remarks, my introductory remarks, come from my wife, actually. We need to get curious, not furious. That's It's worked wonders in my marriage, and it would work wonders with the FBI and privacy advocates, we need to start talking to one another. Now, we should not bring ISIL into this conversation. We don't want to take their needs into account, but certainly, and it's not just American, we have to deal with the different privacy laws in different parts of the world. And to give you an example that this is not just blue sky thinking, 1978, NSA, loosely speaking, wanted to throw me in jail for publishing my papers because I was telling people how to do strong encryption, and it was being published in international journals. And this was viewed as a violation of the international traffic in arms regulations. So we were carrying on not even a debate, a war in the press. And of course, you can imagine whose side the press was on, freedom of speech. And so NSA was Darth Vader, and I was half the age I am now, so I was Luke Skywalker, at least in my own mind. And Admiral Inman, Bobby Inman, who was director of NSA at the time, is a really out-of-the-box thinking kind of guy. And I got a call from his office that said, would you be willing to meet with him? And I said, sure, it'd be nice to finally talk face-to-face rather than fighting it out in the New York Times. And when he came to my office, he looked at me and he said, first words, because jokingly, he said, nice to see you don't have horns. Because that's the impression that they were giving him at NSA. And he told me he was meeting with me against the advice of all the senior people at the agency, because the directorship rotates through, but there are senior people there. Well, Luke Skywalker looked at Darth Vader and said, same here, because I had been picturing them as the devil incarnate. And that started a very cautious discussion, which became really a very good friendship. And I regard Admiral Inman as a good friend today, and vice versa. So it is possible. Same thing happened 20 years ago. There was a debate over Clipper chip, key escrow, actually very similar to the current debate. And I think we need to go back and look at that and see what lessons we can learn from that. And again, a lot of vitriol. The national academies, under its research arm, the National Research Council, pulled together a committee, a balance committee. It had privacy advocates like myself. It had a former Attorney General, Benjamin Civiletti, representing the FBI's interests. It had a former Deputy Director of NSA, Ann Cara Christie, great woman who unfortunately passed away about a year ago, representing National Security Agency and national security interests in general. And we reached unanimous conclusions in that. We had to trade, you're right, there are trade-offs. We had to balance this versus that. But the important thing was to talk with an open mind, get curious, not furious, and to learn from what happened 20 years ago. Let's see. Oh, there's a whole bunch of other things, but I'll save that for the discussion. I will make a plug, though. There's a section of my new book, Get Curious, Not Furious. It's called A New Map for Relationships. Just Google it. Look at Amazon. You can find it. And hopefully that can solve our problems, too.
Well, thank you very much. So we'll move to Europe because there are some of the important challenges faced by the countries. And I actually was sitting in participating to a conference at Europol about this very issue of encryption, lawful access to data, and privacy. And we had that long conversation for 2 days, but we didn't reach any kind of consensus.
Get my wife there.
Yeah, well, we'll work on that. So I know, Joëlle, you're not that eager about getting into the debate over encryption, but maybe you could tell us more about some of the specific challenges that European countries faced in trying to disrupt activities of terrorists online.
Sure, and thank you very much for having me here on the panel. I think what I'd like to do is, of course, focus primarily on the sort of internet-related aspects, but I would be remiss if I only talked about it. And I think it's also important to sort of at least briefly mention the broader ecosystem, if you will, and the action that the EU is taking sort of in addition. And I think with 150 deaths by terrorist acts last year and 130, I believe, this year so far, this is very much at the heart of many of the policy conversations, as you can imagine today. At the same time, I think it's important we remind ourselves that terrorism in Europe is not new. Think about the Red Brigades in the 70s, think about IRA, think about ETA. But of course, what's new is the social media, it's the globalized communication, it's the means that technology gives to terrorists. Why do I underline that? Because in the way that we've been looking at sort of our response to the terrorist threats, we want to be very clear that technology is an enabler. But we also need to tackle the drivers, the causes, what's behind. And you can't look at one without looking at the other because, of course, there are interlinkages. And part of what we're doing is funding research on what drives radicalization, because that's also important to understand the behavioral dimensions of the use of the internet and social media in radicalization and self-radicalization. And I'm very glad that Peter Neumann is on this panel, because I think the kind of research that I believe you'll be talking about are very important in sort of informing also our responses in terms of the IT itself. In terms of the internet per se, I'll give you a few of the examples of how the EU has been approaching it. One of the important fora that's been set up is the Internet Forum, which is gathering industry, sort of the European Union, Europol, to really discuss those issues. Why? Because as has been sort of amply discussed over the last year and a half, there was a very strong recognition that the private sector is absolutely critical to addressing some of the challenges, and that innovation is also critical to sort of finding responses to radicalization online. So the EU has been working with industry to promote voluntary code of conduct that some of the sort of internet providers have been sort of accepting to sort of abide by. Sort of that goes in the direction of the discussion we had earlier about norms and sort of ultimately taking responsibility for taking down radicalizing content online. The objective of the Internet Forum are really twofold. They are, on the one hand, as I said, taking down radicalizing content online and incitement of violence, but there's nothing compulsory about it. It's industry which is encouraged to doing it. Europol has set up an internet referral unit to which a lot of material has been referred and taken down. Europol is also using its linguistic competencies to monitor the internet across the full range of EU languages to avoid the whack-a-mole sort of phenomenon of you take down in one language in one country, but of course it pops out elsewhere. But then, very quickly you have to look into the technological sort of answers to recognizing sort of radicalizing content and so on. And I will not repeat what has already been said yesterday on this topic. But also part of the work through the Internet Forum and a lot of the engagement with the private sector and with civil society and with NGOs is to increase the volume of positive narratives. So it's not about governments generating positive narratives or alternative narratives, but it's very much helping NGOs, small organizations that have good stories to tell, to put that out there so that people who are browsing the internet don't always only get the radicalizing comments, but actually get the positive narrative, those that help tone down the discussions and so on. I've mentioned it, but I think there's also in the area of strategic communication, I think it's worth sort of mentioning, particularly linked to Syria, because we know much of the radicalization comes in relation to, of course, IS and what's happening in Syria. An important effort of strategic communication and engaging sort of in relation specifically to the Syria crisis. And I would simply say that much of what was said yesterday on hybrid warfare also resonates here, because we've been supporting strategic communication in relation to the terrorist threats in the context of Syria, but also in how the EU engages with our eastern neighborhood. And there again, it's the same principle. We need to put out there, the facts. There's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of misinformation. We're not into counter-propaganda, we're into telling the story as it is, putting out the facts, helping the alternative voices get online. Now, at a different level, I think a very important role that the EU plays is the normative role. And it's recognizing that cyber, of course, knows no boundaries, and that as EU, we are as weak as our weakest link in a way. So it is important that there are sort of equivalent minimum standards across all the EU member states. And my colleague from ENISA yesterday pointed to some of those examples, for example, with the directive on attacks on information systems, and such sort of legislative procedure that are very important, that we have sort of a common basis across the European Union. But there's also work that has been done to criminalize support to terrorism, so that across the 28 still EU member states, there is a common definition of what is a criminal act in terms of supporting terrorism, in order to enable prosecution of such acts. It is very important also, and I think that's where the EU can also play a key role, to help the member states have a coherent approach in terms of striking the balance between taking down radicalizing content, which is content that incites violence, but also respecting freedom of speech. And the European Court of Human Rights issued a very clear statement in that respect that says that states may sanction incitement to violence and hatred. This is a criminal act. Action may be taken against it. But at the same time, states have to protect speech which offends, shocks, or disturbs the state or any sector of the population. This is very important, not least because when you look at the drivers of radicalization, a lot hinges upon people's perception of unfairness, of being badly treated, discrimination, all of that. Protecting the freedom of speech, protecting sort of human rights online as well as offline is part of supporting the fabric of the European Union and supporting the resilience of European societies to these kinds of threats, to the narrative, to the radicalizing narrative, and so on. So striking that balance has been a critical dimension of the EU action. Now, I said I would say very briefly, and I will be extremely brief because that's less relevant, but it would be missing a critical piece. Some of what we do is that goes slightly beyond purely the internet and cyber dimensions, and particularly working with frontline workers. There's something called the Radicalization Awareness Network, which is about really having people out there in the communities working to recognize people's early signs of radicalization, and funding research to understand what drives radicalization. If you don't have that piece, you also don't understand what's happening online, and then you risk having policy responses that are not tailored to the nature of the problem. Then there is all the work that we're doing sort of in support of the development of norms. It's been dealt with earlier. We'll not go back to this. Dialogues, been leading dialogues with the Americans, with India, with many of the countries that have been present here, in sort of having this normative framework internationally, which is also part of addressing some of those challenges. Now, where do we go from here? I think just at a personal level, I'd point to two issues that would be interesting to debate further, which is there a conversation on how to prevent terrorists from acquiring malicious cyber tools? You can think of export control agreements such as the Wassenaar agreements and so on. And I think there's possibly more of a reflection that's still possible in relation to the restriction on certain dual-use technologies. And sort of another, I think, important question when you think going forward is really how do we address the emergence of cyber safe havens? And that, I think the discussion we had earlier on capacity building is a very important one, because again, in a borderless cyber ecosystem, we can't just think about the security of European citizens in terms of European infrastructure, but we also have to think about how do we address the road state, the cyber sort of safe havens, and the whole direction of travel of the internet. So I just wanted to also just point those are some of the challenges, because we need to be very forward-looking, and that are also part of how we look at the issue.
Well, thank you very much for this very rich contribution, and you've raised a high number of very important points. One that strikes me is the debate over how do we counter terrorist propaganda online is very often focused on one side of propaganda, which is the propaganda that is displayed on the networks, but much more rarely, at least in security discussions, on why are the kids sensitive to that propaganda and the drivers of radicalization, which we will come back to with Peter Neumann later. And in turn, that raises a discussion about the responsibility of governments in what they do in the name of security to make sure that if there is overreaction, it does not encourage further radicalization, and therefore makes the causes of the problem even worse, even though we're trying to counter that problem. So you also mentioned the link to Syria, and then I would like to move to our next speaker to Joseph McGee to explain what is the place of the military in that fight, because the lines are blurred between what is the interior or exterior threat, and then it's really across ministries sometimes that you need to coordinate actions. And I think it's also interesting to see how you can combine the tools, cyber tools, with other more traditional means of action in order to counter that use of the internet.
Okay, thank you. So first off, thank you for allowing me to come here and speak today. Last night we had a great panel discussion on West Point or West Coast. I grew up a couple miles away from here, and then coming out of high school, had a choice between going to Berkeley or West Point. I chose West Point, but come back here frequently. So I think it's not an either or. I think it's both if we're actually going to be effective in the future within cyberspace. So I'm the Deputy Commanding General of U.S. Army Cyber Command. That's a subordinate. That's a subordinate command to the United States Cyber Command, which is headed up by Admiral Rogers. My boss is Lieutenant General Ed Cardone. We're in charge of all of the Army's portion of the cyber force, so man, equip, train, and then operate that. And I just explain that because as this new structure is developing, many people don't understand, but every service has their own component, and I'm the Deputy Commanding General for Operations of the Army's component. So just a couple thoughts, framing thoughts at least, on terrorism and their use of the internet. First off, I agree completely with you, Joëlle, that if we're going to talk about terrorist use of the internet, we can't go immediately down to cyber, because it happens within a larger ecosystem of what drives someone to be radicalized, what causes them to take those actions, and Peter and others are far more expert in that. But if we go too nearly on it, I think we run the risk of not truly addressing the problem and just continue to hunt after symptoms. But as we see it right now, terrorists are using the internet for propaganda, recruiting, fundraising, and then more frequently now for command and control and for distributing in terms of how to run their operations. That's where we are now, but much of this discussion these last couple of days have been about not focusing on where we are today, but where we're going to be in a couple of years. And I think Joëlle, you just mentioned it, that it's not at all hard to imagine that terrorists are not going to be just using it for these functions, but will start actually conducting operations in cyberspace against nations or institutions. And so I think that is probably the evolution of their development. I think we need to start moving in that direction to be ready to counter that, because right now we're seeing them develop rapidly in that capacity. And again, frequently when we look at the terrorist use of the internet, we go sort of narrowly and we think that this is only going to be fought in the cyber domain. And I think the fact of the matter is we need to apply the full suite of forces and powers that we have against their use. And sometimes that's in the air, land, or sea, and sometimes it's in cyber. But there are all sorts of ways to effectively suppress a terrorist use of the internet that have nothing to do with the cyber domain. And I think as we look at that, we've got to make sure we're using all instruments to actually counter that. Because frequently, again, I think because of the uniqueness or the exquisiteness of the cyber field, we go very, very quickly into the technology. But there might be other much more effective ways to suppress it. As we do an operational strategy against that, I think that's many of the things that we try to incorporate. I think, and I know many others do, that this is a field of great potential gain in the private and public partnership in terms of what we're doing as a military or as a government, because unlike in other fields within the military, if you want to find the best submarine drivers and captains within the world, you go to the world's militaries. If you want to find some of the best cyber operators and the people who control a large portion of it, it's all within the private industry. And so blending these together in order to achieve common goals, I think, is very, very important. And the norms and some of these things that we've talked about earlier today, I think, are all part of that. But I think if there is a firewall between what we're doing as a government or as a military and the private fields, then we will be wildly ineffective in a space that is really marked by rapid adaptation by the enemy. And then, speaking of rapid adaptation, the final piece is what we are seeing is that we are innovating as a Department of Defense, as an Army, very, very rapidly to operate in this space. And the U.S. government is struggling to find the policies and procedure that actually can incorporate our actions in a legal framework. And sometimes that's frustrating, but it's also completely necessary. It's completely necessary as we continue to hold firm to the rule of law and the norms that need to gather this. And I think what is happening is, as we are doing more and more operations in cyberspace, we're establishing those legal norms. We're actually just making the tough decisions, and then we're finding the speed of execution is increasing through iteration. But that's what's happening at a national level as we're conducting operations every day. So that's just sort of my initial thoughts.
Thank you very much. So I guess we're going to move to the drivers of radicalization that have been mentioned a number of times, and maybe if you could address also what has been done to counter that radicalization online and how you assess success.
Sure, and thank you, Ambassador. Was just left. I want to start off perhaps to set the scene by talking a little bit about what we've done and why we understand this, and then I'll come to 3 points that directly address your question. I run an institute in London, Research Institute, and in 2012, one of my colleagues, Shiraz Mayer, discovered by accident that young British Muslims were going to Syria and were fighting there, and not only were they down there, but they also maintained their social media presence. They were still active on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, etc. They were posting pictures of their experiences. It became very easy, and for us, very fascinating to follow them, because they were essentially posting online diaries from the battlefront. So for a researcher, this was absolutely amazing. And we discovered quickly that it wasn't just the couple of people that we had discovered initially, but there was hundreds of people who had gone out there and who were online. And over time, over the following 2 years, we built a database that contained the online social media profiles of 750 Westerners, mostly Europeans, who had gone to Syria, mostly to join Islamic State. And we started analyzing that content using Palantir, which was very generous in allowing us to use their platform. But we also at some point discovered that the internet enabled us to communicate with these fighters. So we reached out to them, and of the 750 in our database, we managed to maintain communications with around 150 of them. And because the internet is not everything, we at some point did several trips to the border region in Turkey from where a lot of these fighters had entered into Turkey, and we met with some of them, with some of the transporters who bring them into Syria, with some of the sheikhs that are involved with some of these groups, and we actually were able to communicate with, I would say, less than 10 directly. Now, based on all of that, based on the information that we've accumulated over the past 4 years, and one thing I should say is that when we started doing this in 2012, we went to law enforcement intelligence agencies in Europe, and I won't name them now, but we were telling them about this, and they were saying, "Are you serious? You want us to look at Facebook? We are serious people, we're doing serious work, don't bother us with this." Now they are all coming to us, and they want us to teach them how to find information on social media. However, of course, the game has already to some extent moved on. And since Facebook and Twitter especially have started cracking down on the profiles of fighters, a lot of the communication has migrated to platforms like Telegram, which are encrypted and which are more difficult to get into. In any case, the 3 points that I wanted to make to start with. The first point is that in a lot of the public conversation about ISIS online, the impression is generated as if all the information that is associated with ISIS is actually coming from ISIS. In reality, what you're dealing with here is an internet, or it's an online ecosystem. In 2014, we looked at all the fighters in our database and we collected all the likes, mentions, follows, and expressions of approval from the fighters themselves in order to figure out who are the influential figures for the fighters themselves. And the results were very surprising because the most important radical preachers, the most important people that they themselves followed were not actually part of ISIS. They were not even based in Syria and Iraq, and they had in some cases never been to the region. There's a whole ecosystem of people, such as radical preachers, such as the fighters themselves, who are putting out information that is in favor of ISIS, but that doesn't come directly from ISIS. One of my colleagues, Jared Brackman, many years ago termed this jihadyists. They are often sitting in their bedrooms in London, Paris, and Brussels. And they are producing content, and they're pushing it out. And when we're talking about why ISIS has so much oomph on the internet, why they are so powerful on the internet, it is not only because of what ISIS itself puts out, it is about how the online ecosystem that is associated with ISIS amplifies that across the net. And that's in fact one of the major difficulties that we have in terms of countering this message, because whilst they have generated a swarm, so to speak, we have not managed to create a swarm. US government can produce 2 Twitter accounts, and even if they are good, it's a drop in the ocean compared to what ISIS supporters collectively do on the internet. The second point is, it's not really, in Europe at least, in America it may be different, but in Europe at least, it's not mostly about, or it's not exclusively about online radicalization or online recruitment. We have seen cases of people being recruited online, purely, exclusively online. But the vast majority of cases in Europe involve a crossover between online and offline. And it's very easy to understand. If you look at the map of foreign fighters in Europe, you look where they are coming from, what you will immediately see are clusters. In Germany, for example, in Wolfsburg, Solingen, Dienstlaken, in Britain, in Portsmouth, Cardiff, Brighton, in Belgium, 60% of the foreign fighters are coming from 3 towns. If it was all about the internet, that wouldn't make any sense at all, because the internet is everywhere. These clusters exist because these people have known each other for a very long time. They played football together. They studied together. They worked together. They are friends. The single most significant predictor for why someone goes to Syria to join ISIS is the fact that he personally knows someone who has already gone. The idea that people mobilize exclusively because of being exposed to online propaganda by ISIS, it happens, but it happens very rarely. And I think that also explains why you have a lot less recruitment happening in America than in Europe, because in Europe you do have these ghettos, these structures that facilitate face-to-face recruitment. And the third and the final point, and now I'm really coming to answer your question, is that taking down content, a lot of the public discussion revolves around taking down content. And I'm not against it. I do think some of the content should be taken down, but it's a limiting discussion. There are 3 tools that should be deployed, and they should be deployed equally. Taking down content is one of them. Another one is to actually try to see the fact that all of these extremists are online as an opportunity. They are actually revealing a lot of information about themselves. We've recently started with a small grant from Google to use the online social histories that we have of our 750 fighters. all of it open source. We're not hackers. We don't have any protected information. To see whether there are patterns of expression or behavior that would allow us to conclude this person is at risk of going imminently or perhaps is less at risk of going. And I think there are results that we are already emerging to see. There's a lot of information that you can glean from open source information, never mind protected information, classified information. And if you put as much energy to understanding how people communicate online as you put to taking down content, you could actually use that as a very good tool that would facilitate both intelligence and law enforcement. And the third tool is, of course, counter-speech. It's, again, using the fact that all of these extremists are online and trying to engage them in debate. And I must say, even though I very much appreciate what governments have done in that space, and now, for example, Facebook is starting to do in that space. They started an online civil courage initiative in Germany, for example. But these are all baby steps. We're talking about 1, 2, 3 initiatives across the world. It's all drops in the ocean. And that's because all of these initiatives, including the ones by government, but also by the private sector, are basically top-down. And that's not how the internet works, and that's not how the ISIS swarm works. If you really want to create the scale that is necessary in order to make a difference, you would have to galvanize action from the bottom up. Just to give you one example, and then I'll close with that. The US government had a Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications that produced anti-ISIS videos and communication, which in some cases wasn't so bad. In some cases, it wasn't great. I'm trying to be generous. But the main problem with that was not the content that was produced. It was that if you produce 2 videos a year, that is nothing if you're faced with an organization that even at the top level produces 15 videos a day. So even if the videos that you produce are great, it's a drop in the ocean. What if YouTube did a question of the week? And one of the weeks, the question would be, what's wrong with ISIS? The prize is an internship with Google. I can guarantee you 5,000 student groups across the country, across the world, would start producing videos, 80% of which would be terrible and unusable, 20% of which would be great, and 1% of which would go viral. Now, if you have 5,000 entries into that competition, 1% of 5,000 is 50. That's already 25 times the output of a US government agency at 0 cost. And that's what I mean by galvanizing bottom-up action. This counter-speech thing will only work if we decide to get out of our government attitude and try to understand how the internet works, which is bottom-up, not top-down.
All right, thank you very much. So I think that's pretty much also what governments start understanding. I mean, I know the US government has sort of dropped the idea of doing counter-messaging itself because they believe they're not a credible voice. And now there is this idea to encourage others to provide content or just to curate the internet in order to find relevant content and try to amplify it. So that leads me, what you brought up, to 2 questions for the panelists. One, which relates to your second point, I think, about all the information that's available out there. We know that there is a lot of intelligence work about catching the bad guys. Now, is there as much exploitation of open sources in order to do that research and to understand better the drivers of radicalization and the patterns in order to be more on the preventive side and in order to address the root causes of radicalization? And then for the counter-messaging, I think your remarks, all your remarks lead to the question, so what is the place of governments and the place of the platforms? And I would love to have someone from Google or Facebook on the panel, but maybe you could make comments from the room. And the right place of civil society. How do we articulate that in order to create that dynamic that you're describing? So.
I'd actually like to hit the open source question, and it relates to the title of this panel, Going Dark. It's important to recognize when, and I understand where the FBI feels like, wait a minute, we can't get to this cell phone, and this guy just killed 15 people. I mean, shouldn't we get at it? And if there was a way to open up that phone all by itself, I would do it. But important thing to recognize, and maybe there is, and we need to talk about that. Right now I don't see it. But it's important to recognize that at least an order of magnitude, at least 10 times as much raw information is flowing into law enforcement and national security intelligence operations as in the good old days, which they often talk about. The good old days were the 50s, when you got a wiretap, you went in and you actually tapped a wire and you could hear what was being said, whereas now sometimes it's encrypted. But you didn't have surveillance cams back then. You didn't have the storage that allows those surveillance cams, to store it for weeks, almost infinitely. You didn't have cell phone data where a person's moving around. You didn't have all the email, most of which is still unencrypted, although possibly moving in that direction. Automatic license plate readers, and more. So, for sake of argument, I don't know what the numbers are. Maybe someone in the audience does. Let's say that there's only 10 times as much information, raw information. I think it's actually more. And let's say 10% of it's encrypted. Then law enforcement and other groups that should be getting information are getting 9 times as much information as before. Because they're getting 10 times, in this hypothetical, 10 times as much information, 10% of which is dark. They're getting 9 times as much as in the good old days, but they're stymied time and time and time again and frustrated, understandably. I wish we could get to that. But then we have to look at the trade-offs. One other thing in terms of carrying on a dialogue and not being in enemy territory, even if it's because of Berkeley rather than FBI. I forgot to mention that a new National Research Council committee has just been formed. It was just announced by the Computer and Telecommunications Board of the National Research Council, which is going to revisit the kinds of questions we looked at 20 years ago. The one thing I would like to make sure is that it actually, while it's a National Research Council, that it almost is like an international research council, because this is an international problem.
You want to
Just thank you briefly to follow on the professor's point and his earlier point. Yes, that's exactly why I'm here, is to have this conversation. And the director has referred to it many times now publicly as the need for an adult conversation. And
yes,
that's exactly what we're trying to continue to have. We all understand that in the context of litigation, certainly in hard-fought litigation, particularly in the context of a terrorist attack, such as the litigation we were involved with Apple some months ago, the rhetoric does get a little heated and elevated, and I think we can all benefit from trying to tamp that down, and especially outside the context of litigation. And so that's certainly our goal. But you're right, the open source opportunities are certainly there, and the U.S. government in many ways spends enormous resources on taking advantage of that. With respect to the going dark problem, though, of course, what the FBI has been concerned about is with a warrant. And this is lost, I should add. I've had many discussions with otherwise very smart people, lawyers, especially during the litigation with Apple, who didn't seem to understand that, I'm sure this crowd does, but just to emphasize it, didn't seem to understand that what we were talking about was accessing data with a warrant, with a search warrant signed by a neutral judge, not some kind of unilateral, covert, secret ability on the part of the FBI to access this data, but only with a warrant. And I hope that's understood now, that it's only with a warrant that we're trying to access.
Let me assure you, that was understood. The problem is how you do it for the one phone without opening up everyone's.
That's right, and therein lies the rub, right? And that's why we're committed to having this conversation. But you're right, that's the point. That's, the open source availability and opportunities are significant. That is a constant source of exploitation by the government. It's the narrow slice where we with a warrant, we've identified a device. We believe there's evidence of a crime. We've gone to a neutral magistrate. He has or she has looked at our probable cause affidavit. He or she has said, yes, you should have access, and we can't because of technological reasons. That's the problem.
If you want to reflect maybe on the role of private sector and
I think, put it simply, the role of government, or for us of a multilateral organization with the EU, is to put the facts out there and to support those civil society actors who can put moderate narrative and counter narrative online, and we have various ways of doing so, through providing funding and helping and so on, and I've mentioned them already. There's a lot of work in terms of the regulatory framework, establishing what are the rules of the games, and one example I didn't give earlier would be on financing of terrorism, and a legislation that looks at the issue of bitcoins and the confidentiality of virtual currencies. Those are the kinds of dimensions where government, the EU, can be active. But when it comes to content, this is not something that as government or as the EU we feel well placed to do. That has to be the private sector taking responsibility through initiatives such as the Code of Conduct, and deciding on a voluntary basis what they maintain, what they take down in terms of content. And also recognizing that all the infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector, also encouraging having those conversations with the private sector, with industry, with civil society on what are the best responses.
The only thing I'll add to the conversation is two things. Certainly we use open source information constantly and are using that to the maximum. And to the professor,
Is your mic on?
it's supposed to be on.
Oh, okay.
Brief back. But to the professor's point about, we have 9 times more, but we're still missing the 10%. I mean, you have to recognize that a smart cyber operator is going to encrypt the most important 10%. And so while we are awash in information, not all information is in fact the same, and someone who's actually savvy in the cyberspace will encrypt it in order to increase, their effectiveness. And so I understand where you're going with there is more information. We definitely exploit that open source information, but I believe most of the truly valuable information that enables operations is moving towards an encrypted space, which makes it more difficult to access.
That would be a good thing for a study to look at, because to see what data there is there. In the NRC committee I served on 20 years ago, one of the men who was on it said one of the most frequent things we hear just before, when they were tapping phones, just before we get some really good information, is, I probably shouldn't say this on the phone, but. And so I think, so I'd like to see, you may be right, but I'd like to see the data. I think people are sloppy, even the quote sophisticated terrorists. But I have no direct knowledge. I'm just basing on what I know of people, myself included.
Maybe just one more question to Peter before we open up to the audience. Do we have any means to evaluate what we're doing in terms of countering propaganda?
It's very difficult, and I'm often being asked that question by government officials. Is there good data on how effective some of these counter-speech initiatives have been? And the answer is no, because there have been so few. And so I think before we even get it to the point of knowing exactly what works and what doesn't work, we need to generate content and need to generate activity that allows us to even start measuring what works and what doesn't work. Governments being involved in that space directly often doesn't work, not only because of the credibility gap, but also, and I would say even more importantly, because governments, with all respect, are kind of almost the opposite of the internet. The head of this of CSCC at the former head of CSCC at the State Department told me that before the State Department was allowed to send a tweet, there were 16 layers of approval, right? In the internet, you have to be quick. You cannot wait for 2 weeks until you have 16 signatures under a tweet before you're allowed to send it. And you also have to be able to take risks. You get attention on the internet because you say things that are perhaps a little bit outrageous. And that's exactly what governments do not want to do. So if you give governments the key responsibility to wage that counter-propaganda war, it's never going to go anywhere, because in many respects, the internet is the opposite of what governments are.
Right. I guess that goes in line with the issue we had with our app for terrorist alerts in France, and for these terrorist attacks. The information came actually 2 hours later because they had to physically wake up someone to send the alert. So I would like to open the audience for questions, if we can have microphones.
André Kudelski, thank you for the presentation. I have just a question coming back to the 10% encrypted. Today, do we have the possibility, by looking at non-encrypted data through big data, to really find what is missing in the information that was sent in clear and that will be most probably encrypted, but to regenerate the information that was sent in a different way?
I have no idea. Anybody here or in the audience?
Well, I mean, I guess what, if I may, would answer is it depends what you need the information for. If it's for evidence, and because you want to prosecute someone, then it's not going to work.
Yeah, that's hard to say, and it gets into a lot of things that we can't talk about. But
And you don't know what was encrypted. So how do you even measure it?
Sorry. Yeah. Do you want to pursue the conversation? Yes, we have a question here. It's coming.
So I have sort of a provocative comment. We'll see what the reaction is. We'll start with just a technological point. So it is possible to develop defeasible encryption so that you could decrypt it under certain circumstances. And to the extent that the imperatives of the state are not serviced by the supply chain that's producing it, they will go around those provisions. So you drive them into the supply chain, various things you don't like. And that's just going to happen. You could have the legal system bound to a cryptographic scheme that when you obtained your search warrant, you would have scope and temporal access to some specific target. And you could also have a cryptographic scheme in order to have an audit to know whenever that was used. It's a research problem, but we could have people look at that. And so that's what we're thinking about. On the other hand, we had a conference back in March, and we had a bunch of very aware Russia-China analysts on a panel. And one of the China analysts just went off on the whole privacy thing they were seeing in the US, saying that certain vendors were, in order to sell their products in China, had to submit to all kinds of access questions. So the story that we see here in the US is more of a PR issue rather than what they're really doing worldwide. So I just kind of roll those out and ask the panel, is there some kind of practical, realistic way to manage these trade-offs where you can catch terrorists, you can accomplish some of the things the state needs to do, and you can optimize the privacy of the private individuals? Thank you.
Thank you.
I could take a shot at that. That's exactly what is ongoing, and that we're trying to be a part of. And I think what folks need to remember is that the privacy thing, as you described it, is not absolute. It never has been absolute. The Constitution of our country, anyways, doesn't contemplate that it's absolute. And so it's that trade-off, that balance, that is struck in every, there's a courtroom somewhere in Santa Clara County right now in which a magistrate judge is striking that balance between an individual's right to privacy and the government's search warrant affidavit saying it believes that there's probable cause, that there's evidence in that apartment or what have you, and that balance is being struck. In that context, it's a relatively low-tech balance that we're used to striking, judges are used to striking, and what we're obviously struggling with is a higher tech balancing mechanism to get at the encryption realities that we're dealing with. But that's exactly what we're we're trying to do. So I appreciate your comment.
The problem is how, thinking of the Apple FBI suit in particular, the problem is how you give, I would love it if I could give the FBI access to that phone without then opening up Pandora's box. And that's something we need to talk about. Maybe there's some way that I'm missing for doing that, but I don't see it. I'm not as current on cryptography as some of my other colleagues, but Ron Rivest, who is at MIT, was co-author with a number of other people of Keys Under Doormats, which made that exact point. And I think we need to bring people like Michael Hayden into this, former director of NSA, who, now he may be wrong, but he said in January of this year, I disagree with Jim Comey, the FBI director. I actually think end-to-end encryption is good for America. I know encryption represents a particular challenge for the FBI, but on balance, I actually think it creates greater security for the American nation than the alternative, a backdoor. Now, we need to discuss that. I mean, maybe he's missing something. Admiral Inman, the guy who was in charge of the agency that wanted to throw me in jail 40 years ago, 35 years ago. 2 years ago, the Stanford Alumni Magazine did an article on this first crypto war, the freedom of us to publish our papers. And I'm just going to quote from that. A second question is whether Hellman was right to worry that a lack of strong cryptography would become, quote, an economic privacy threat in a computerized economy. In an unexpected turn, today Inman is as worried about protecting non-governmental computer systems as Hellman was in the 1970s. When asked if he would make the same decisions about non-governmental cryptography now as he did then when they tried to suppress our work, Inman replied, and this was in an interview, rather than being careful to make sure they weren't going to damage our collection capabilities, NSA's, I would have been interested in how quickly they were going to be able to make crypto systems available in a form that would protect proprietary information as well as government information. That's the end of the quote. The theft of portions of the designs for the F-35 jet, Inman said, demonstrates that weak non-governmental encryption and computer security practices can grievously harm national security. So we do have to look at the trade-off. And I fully recognize that privacy is not an absolute. The question is how we balance violating the privacy of the suspect, where the court order has been issued, with the privacy of everyone else.
So this tend to validate two things I've noticed is once this is a debate that comes back regularly and then we make decisions and it comes back a few years later. And the other remark is it tends to take up much of the debate. So maybe if we could try in the following questions to maybe move to the other aspects, that would be great. I think we had two questions out there.
Yes, although you just told me not to ask my question.
Oh, okay, well.
Because I'm Brad Templeton, former chairman of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, so you can guess that I'm more on Marty's side in this and feel that the reason the question keeps coming back is because we believe not that the FBI is wrong about whether the concept or privacy is an absolute, but that there have been attempts to go beyond regulating what government can do into trying to change the physics and mathematics of the world to say that you cannot make things tamper-proof because by making them tamper-proof you interfere with an important government ability to see what's gone dark. I think if you had asked, and this is one of these things I hate when other people say it, but I'm going to say it, if you asked the authors of the Fourth Amendment what they would think about today's communications environment and the accessibility to government of all the communications we have to do, they would be, well, completely dumbfounded at the volume of it compared to what they had when they wrote that amendment. And I think Marty's right. We're going bright. We're not going dark. And this is something that people have to realize. You cannot change these rules of mathematics. You cannot change these rules of physics unless you want to enable it for the People's Liberation Army and a lot of other people. And that's, of course, what the NSA former director said as well. But to get to the other side, the censorship side, let me also say that when I hear people say the internet in the context of the way they said it, I think of it, I've been on it since the 70s, even though I'm old, I sort of grew up on it in a way. The internet, I think the roads, when you say something, or I think the post office. And when you say, we've got to regulate the roads and stop people from having the wrong ideas when they drive down them. We have to regulate the post office and not let people send the wrong mails. These metaphors come completely differently to my mind, and I want to understand there are many people who think of it that way and who want to say that you cannot just say because this medium is different, because it offers a few more avenues into it, that now we will treat it and we will change the rights that we cherished in the old system. One last quick point to our representative from the FBI. Your agency does indeed, I believe, do what you said and wait for warrants before it intercepts traffic. There are other agencies that are perhaps not so charitable.
And other countries.
Yes, and of course other countries. So that was mostly a screed, and I apologize, but maybe there's some commentary on it.
And maybe any commentary, or can we move to the? Yep.
No, it's great to hear someone acknowledge that, yes, we do obtain warrants. That's what we do. There are AUSAs all around the country right now doing just that, and the FBI is not conducting searches until and unless they get that warrant. So thank you for acknowledging that.
Joëlle, you had a comment?
No, I would simply pick up on the point about the censorship and very much agree, I think, with the gist of what you were saying. And if you take the international discussion, for example, in the UN context, where there are many discussions on, again, in applicability of international law and the norms and so on, this question, I think, is expressed in two, to simplify, two worldviews. Those that argue that you need international laws and to sort of counter the negative effects, and on those, and that's the camp in which the EU and our member states are very firmly, that say you cannot use the threats and the perceived sort of danger that comes with the internet. You cannot let that be used to justify censorship, be it online, be it offline. So respect for human rights, respect for freedom of speech is absolutely central to the societies we are. I think if I drew an analogy, for example, to the threats that are associated with chemical weapons or biological weapons, you can say, well, through the internet now, knowledge is available that makes unprecedented access to lethal means to non-state actors, to individuals. But you can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't say, we're going to suppress that kind of knowledge. So what you have to sort of educate people, you have to foster debate, you have to raise awareness, and there's no alternative but to maintaining the freedom of speech, the access to information that are at the very basis of progress, of growth, and of sort of the sustainability of the model.
Thank you. I think there was another question right here.
Thank you. I actually have two questions. First, a clarification to Mr. Brower. Are you saying that the FBI never has and never will seek to unlock a phone in a situation where you don't have a warrant, for example, a border search exception to the warrant requirement, or where the phone is seized outside the United States from somebody who's not a U.S. citizen? You don't do phone unlocking then?
No, thank you for the clarification. Let me say 99% of searches conducted by the federal government generally, whether it's FBI, ATF, DEA, what have you, are done with a warrant. There are exceptions to the warrant requirement, as those of us who practice in this area know, and so no, it's not a 100% warrant situation. But it's about a 99%. There are exceptions. Thank you for clarifying that.
I'd love to see the numbers on that. My next question is for Mr. Neumann. I have a question. You said that there were certain pockets where people come from, where they tend to travel to Syria, and that the best predictor is if you know somebody who's gone. I think that's super interesting. I'm wondering what your research shows in terms of things like economic issues like poverty, those sorts of things, and what other kinds of drivers we see, because we talked a lot on this panel about, the internet and whether that's the cause, just like airplanes are the things that really take people to Syria, or boats, that's a problem also. But I'm wondering, like, what if we're going to think outside of this kind of sort of, military interdiction way of thinking about the problem, what are the other things that we should be looking at other than counter speech in terms of, economic opportunity, or what are you really seeing there?
Okay, so this takes us a little bit away from the online discussion. It's true there are these pockets, but even the problem with predicting radicalization based on very broad macro factors like income, social, economic factors is that radicalization, predicting whether someone in particular is going to mobilize into extremist violence, is a very micro phenomenon. It depends on a lot of things, including who you know. However, we always try to explain it with not micro factors, but macro factors. And for every town from Belgium from which a lot of foreign fighters have gone to Syria, I can give you a very similar small town in Belgium from which practically no one has gone. And what we often see in these places is indeed the sort of pattern whereby 2 or 3 people start going, they stay in touch with their friends back home, and successively they then go over and join them. All of that said, if we look at the particular phenomenon of ISIS mobilization across Europe, across continental Europe, it is by and large a phenomenon that has affected the so-called losers in society. If you look at figures on foreign fighters, for example, provided by the German government, 2/3 of the people who have gone to join ISIS were known to the police. 1/3 had convictions. In fact, of the 1/3 that had convictions, I think something like 2/3 of those had been convicted for 8 or more offenses. So they were serial perpetrators of criminal offenses, often from the poorest parts of these places. 25% unemployment. In Norway, 70% of them were known to police. In France, 60%. So these are people who are not necessarily part of the winners of society. And we may see a genuine shift here because 15 years ago, when we were talking about the 9/11 perpetrators, we were talking about students, middle-class people, you know, I cannot count the number of occasions where I've been told in a panel session, Osama bin Laden was the son of a millionaire. Yes, he may have been, but a lot of his followers were not. And what we're seeing now with ISIS is that it is really a mobilization, if you want, of, for lack of a better word, the Muslim underclass in Europe, often from the suburbs of places like Paris, from certain very disenfranchised parts of places like Brussels. And you know, whilst for everyone who is poor and comes from the suburbs of Paris, who becomes a terrorist, there are 1,000 people who are poor and come from the suburbs of Paris who do not become terrorists. However, there is, I do believe, some kind of correlation between the lack of perspective that people see. And if you are someone who is 21, perhaps from an immigrant background, who sits in the suburbs of Paris and looks at these pictures of fighters from Islamic State, what do you see? You see young men, just like yourself, with weapons, being very powerful in that society, being heroes, being admired, having a lot of fun, experiencing community, experiencing structure, and doing something purposeful with their lives. And they are being told that people in 1,000 years' time will still speak about you if you come and join us and build that great new society. It's a very empowering thing for someone who sits in the suburbs of Paris and perhaps has no perspective in that society at all and does not consider himself to be part of that French Republican project. It's one thing for the Prime Minister of France to speak about liberté, égalité, fraternité, but they do not consider themselves to be part of that. So it becomes something very, very attractive to go there. And I do think there is something about that.
If I might go on with the issue of counter-messaging, or I mean, obviously how you can bring another message and all the content that needs to be put out there is important. But one of the questions I had, the people you're describing very often get trapped into a sort of bubble or an echo chamber where that is said to be reinforced by algorithms. So once they're into that bubble, ideologically isolated with people who tend to reinforce their beliefs, I mean, how do you manage to get the message to them? How do you break that bubble?
It's very hard, if not impossible, at that point to still get them. That's why you have to try to get the people before they get into that very narrow echo chamber that you've talked about, because that's actually something that we can prove, that people then barely communicate with people that do not actually hold the same views as themselves. So you have to identify them before they get into that. But one point that I wanted to add also about the previous discussion about what governments can do in this counter-speech space. One thing that we've noticed, for example, is, and this has been pointed out by government officials, the number of foreign fighters has dramatically dropped. Very few people still go to join ISIS in Syria. And that's because the narrative is no longer powerful. The narrative in the middle of 2014 was, the caliphate is coming. We are strong, we are powerful. Our motto is, we're staying here and expanding. And the facts on the ground confirmed that narrative, because every week ISIS was taking another province of Iraq. And the most significant, useful thing that governments have been doing to undermine that narrative has been not anything on the internet, but has been to stop the advance of ISIS. Because if you look at ISIS videos today, they are often struggling to explain why all their promises and predictions have not come true. Whilst in 2014 their propaganda was triumphalist, now it is very defensive, to the point where the spokesperson of ISIS recently said, it was never our intention to hold any territory, after the whole organization was created for exactly that purpose. It's almost like a government spin doctor. Oh, it was never our intention to do that. So it's become very, very defensive, and people realize, and we see, for example, that some of the fighters who are in Syria and Iraq are communicating, are using the internet to communicate to their friends back home that the situation is terrible, and that they shouldn't come, and that the whole thing is basically breaking down.
So if I,
Well, what brings up, there's kind of an implicit assumption, at least I feel there's been an implicit assumption here, that we are failing in our fight against terrorism. And I think it would be really good to re-examine that. Joëlle, how many people did you say died last year in terrorist attacks? Was this in Western Europe?
I think it's 150.
And was that just Western Europe?
Yes.
Okay. How many days or fraction of a day of traffic deaths is that? I mean, of course, the better we can do, the fine. But there may be some minimal level below which we cannot go, and I think we need to be looking at that. So maybe the FBI is doing a damn good job, because in this country it hasn't been that many either.
Now, Professor, I would. You bring up a very interesting point. I think you're absolutely right. I will tell you, though, we feel that the FBI and the other intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and I know that our friends at DoD feel like we need to bat 1,000, though.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the objective, that is the expectation, that is the goal every day, is to bat 1,000. Is it possible? Well,
And that's
no,
where the trade-offs come in. To bat 1,000, we're going to have to do a lot of things on the privacy front that would be pretty horrendous. And so maybe 300 is damn good for.
Well, I'd like to think we can.
And we're a lot better than that.
Can I just add one thing? Because, whilst I agree with a lot of what you say, I think it's missing one aspect of terrorism, which is precisely that it is about politically motivated violence. Mm-hmm. It's not only about killing people, it's about achieving political effects. And yes, I totally agree with you, and there are these wonderful articles out there that say more people die in bathtubs every year, and a lot of other funny things that happen that are more dangerous than terrorism. But if you look at Europe and what these few acts of terrorism have done to our societies, the kind of polarizing effect they have had on the political system, the way that people treat each other with suspicion, it is actually messing with the fabric of our society. Right. Those deaths are terrible, but equally profound is the political effect that terrorism has on our way of life.
Which we might be able to change. I mean, we have some control over that. I was just reading the New York Times, I think this morning, about the bombing in New York, and they were describing all the chemicals that were used. And I was thinking, the only people interested in this are other terrorists. I'm not even interested in it. And why do we print the picture? I mean, again, it's not, I'm not saying there should be official censorship, but what about a general agreement that any newspaper, any magazine that prints a picture of a terrorist is aiding the terrorists?
Well, I mean, you also have...
Why do we have to see his picture?
You also have the political debate in the context of elections. Obviously, that's not the direction we're going. So I just reflect on what you were saying about the fact that there were less foreign fighters. I actually had a question for Joseph and Joëlle to see whether that's also your assessment of the situation, knowing that now the rhetoric of the Daesh has been to move to the idea of a cyber caliphate, and they're encouraging people to stay in their own country and act. And we're seeing actually women now coming up, and although on the front they're there to cook and raise children, but in Europe they start having a different status. So I mean, do you believe that we're seeing the numbers decreasing, or is it just taking a different form?
The numbers are unquestionably decreasing. I mean, that's borne by evidence, and it's true of European foreign fighters. It's true of those that come from other countries around the world. That said, it doesn't mean that the problem in itself is per se decreasing. I couldn't agree more with what you were saying about how powerful it has been to debunk IS narrative by sort of tackling its most powerful asset, which was territory, and having territory and being in an unprecedented situation of a terrorist group holding onto territory. But what we see as well is that if you look back at the waves of terrorists that have been spawned out of the wars in Afghanistan, those are then the foreign fighters that have gone on elsewhere to wage jihad and to continue and find different forms. So I think terrorism is morphing, it's evolving, and I think that paradoxically, the successes in Iraq may actually lead to an increase in terrorist acts in Europe, because IS do need to have a different narrative that is successful. So they do need to demonstrate they are retaining a capacity to hurt and to have terrorist actions in Europe, sort of also reaching out to people who have nothing to do with IS per se, but putting out the means through the internet. So the problem is morphing, it's evolving, and will remain very real for long times to come.
No, I agree, and it's a fallacy to believe that if you defeat ISIS in Syria and Iraq, that will mean the end of ISIS. We know that 30,000 people are estimated to have gone as fighters to Iraq and Syria, probably around 20,000 to ISIS. Of those 20,000, 15% have died, and about 35% have returned to their home countries already, which means that there are about 10,000 fighters still in ISIS territory. If Raqqa and Mosul fall, which I hope they will, these fighters will face exactly the same questions that Osama bin Laden and others faced at the end of the Afghanistan conflict in the 1980s, which is, what next? We fought here, we've brutalized ourselves, we've networked internationally, where do we go next? And based on the experience in the 1980s, you then saw in the 1990s and 2000s, you saw these so-called veterans of the conflict turning up in literally every conflict in the Muslim world, and some of them getting together to form an international terrorist network that became Al-Qaeda, carrying out the 9/11 attacks in 2001. 14 years after the end of the Afghanistan conflict, you had a massive terrorist attack that essentially can be traced back to the kinds of people that met in Afghanistan in the 1980s. So I'm warning against saying, once we've defeated ISIS, Syria, and Iraq, it's over. Many years from now, we will still, I fear, see the consequences of what's happening. And just one word on the women. It is true that we've seen an increasing number of women being mobilized and going to Syria and Iraq. I think that has two reasons. One, I'm afraid, is the internet, which has made it easier for women to become involved in that movement. which previously they had few opportunities to physically engage in. Women in that particular movement couldn't just go to meetings because they weren't allowed to interact with people. The internet has made it easier. And whatever recruitment efforts we have seen, actual recruitment efforts, have typically been of women, by women who had already traveled to the so-called caliphate. And the second reason why women were mobilized in such numbers was because in 2014, with the creation of the so-called caliphate, the jihadist movement, for the first time in its history, had a project to offer in which women had a place. Whereas before, they were always calling for fighters. If you are a fighter, come to the tribal areas of Pakistan, come to Somalia, we need you. What they were saying then, in 2014, was we are creating a new society. And of course we need fighters, but we also need nurses, we need teachers, we need the mothers of the next generation of fighters. And suddenly it turned into a project that was also attractive to women. And the numbers really skyrocketed from that point onwards.
Thank you. Did you want to?
I think
So we have time for one more question. I don't have a question. Maybe I'll ask the last question, maybe to Josette. You mentioned in your talk at the beginning that what you worried about was the next stage of development, meaning terrorists acquiring malicious tools and conducting attacks. So are we seeing any evidence that they might move to large-scale cyber attacks in addition to what's going on?
Here to you. I think it's a, so I don't think we're seeing any clear indications, but I mean, I think we've all seen.
Could you take the mic, because yours doesn't work.
Challenged. I don't think we see any clear indications that it's happening, but I think we all predict that that is something that will happen and evolve over time. It's a natural progression that will happen as some of these cyber tools, I think, seep out into the greater community, and potentially even as terrorist groups are seeded by nation-state actors who want to give them those tools. So there's nothing, I don't know if that's clear, but I think it's a natural evolution that we should anticipate and try to get ahead of.
But if you weigh it in terms of the resources requires and the uncertainty of the effects, I mean, how does that compare in terms of strategic effect to driving a truck into a crowd?
I'm sorry, can you say that?
How does that compare in terms of strategic effect? And I mean, if you balance out the resources it involves to conduct a successful cyber attack that is going to create a huge impact with the resources it takes to drive a truck within a crowd, and then you compare the cost and benefits, do you think they're going to go that route?
Well, I think as our friend from the FBI who fielded almost all the government's questions, and I'm very thankful for that. I think, as he pointed out, I think our security services writ large do a fairly good job of keeping the United States very safe. And so I think the enemy will continue to find other ways to attack the United States, and cyberspace might be one of those possibilities where, with advanced technologies in a couple of years, they may be able to find a vulnerability they can exploit. I'm not sure if that's shutting down a power grid or shutting out, I'm not talking about that, but probably much smaller scale attacks, at least initially. But again, I do think it does discuss, or at least bears to reinforce just how good of a job, sort of knock on wood, that our security services do balancing the needs of privacy against security, and then protecting the United States against a number of actors who would wish to do us harm.
Simply totally echoing this in terms of, it's a development that one has to anticipate whether it happens or not. I think if you draw a parallel with chemical weapons, you see ISIL acquiring the means of using chemical weapons in Syria, questions about their capability also to have chemical weapons in Libya, and that is precisely because of the strategic impact, because of the psychological impact. You don't kill a lot of people with chemical weapon on the whole, but it has an enormous psychological impact of instilling fear that in terms, and I'll so refer to what was just said about the political sort of impact, how about changing our society, and ultimately that's very much what the terrorist effort is about. So it is, I think, potentially something that can happen, has to be acknowledged. But part of it, I think we have a responsibility to talk to the public about the fact that it can happen, to prepare the public for some of the risks, and sort of zero risk doesn't exist. So sort of having a grown-up conversation about the risks linked to that is also part, I think, of our sort of collective responsibility.
Thank you. Well, that's going to be the take-home message. Zero risk doesn't exist. I would like you to join me in thanking the panelists for their job.